I had to stop this now, so bye, because I mean,
Okay, and I want to remind you next time to let you go first.
sorry.
So you should be able to do that so that it goes full. You should be able to, you're in control of that. So you should be able to make it, yeah, there you go.
I think it's,
Yeah, that's, I think that's about as good as it gets.
yeah.
As good as you're gonna get. That's better than what I can see here.
Yeah.
So everybody's had they filled out their waiver. They know that I had dinner with somebody I had dinner with someone yesterday who has COVID today. So, no. I don't know. So
I got it if you need.
mask,
Need a mask?
I have,
you wanna watch from another room? I tested negative twice today, but you know, that's only as good as the test.
You have?
yeah,
And
I tested negative for COVID, but yeah, well, thank you.
so anything, whatever you wanna do to be comfortable is fine with me,
We got one more,
including
That's what I-
leaving or whatever.
one more. It's a fresh, unused. Okay,
All right.
you've been offered. Thank you for the heads up. about
Yeah.
it.
Sure, yeah. And again, no, if you change your mind in the middle, 5 minutes into this, if I suddenly like, my eyes don't look right, you can decide, don't trust my testing or whatever, there's no offense taken if people have to leave, or if you want to watch remotely from next door or whatever. And then we're just waiting for Deborah, I guess, right?
So, yeah,
On her way.
There she is.
Oh. awesome.
Have a 5-minute drive.
Negatives.
Yep. Negative sign.
Uh-huh. So far, so good. I mean,
Yeah, so did you have into that or?
I did,
Okay.
although we have a late arrival, so I'm testing negative. I've tested twice today, but I was exposed to someone who tested positive. With someone yesterday who tested positive this morning. So, why I'm wearing a mask. But my second test was about
Mask.
half an hour ago and it's negative. Tested this morning, negative.
I think I have.
I don't know if I'm gonna test negative tomorrow morning, but I'll know tomorrow morning. But all of you are free to do whatever makes you comfortable, including leaving. Which people often do once I start talking anyway, so.
And multiple people were exposed yesterday. So all of us who were exposed yesterday, Enrique, Kelsey, and me were all wearing masks. And I also tested negative just like a half an hour ago. But it would have been too soon. But also we're taping this. So it's fine if anybody wants to leave. And it's also, we've got a WebEx if anybody wants to join remotely. So we're doing everything that we know how to do. Okay, I have the pleasure of introducing our visitor. And actually, I got ChatGPT to give.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh. This is my first GPT introduction.
Yes, so Bruce Chorpita is a clinical psychologist and researcher known for his work in the field of child and adolescent mental health. He's particularly recognized for his contributions to the development and implementation of evidence-based treatments for youth with emotional and behavioral disorders. He's currently a professor at the University of California, LA, and a researcher at UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. That last one's true too.
That's all true so far.
Okay, so that's all it
Oh,
says.
that's it, okay.
But I wanted to add a little bit.
Okay.
So I thought that was pretty good.
That's all very accurate.
Yeah. So Bruce and Bruce has at least two connections to the capital region. One is he got his Ph.D. from SUNY Albany. So that's super cool. And his son is a freshman at RPI.
Yes.
So that's very exciting too. So we hope to see Bruce a whole lot. And Bruce and I are kicking off a new project. I'm calling it Semantic Behavioral Health. He'll give you a whole lot of background for that. And we also overlapped because Bruce was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee Accelerating Behavioral Science through Ontology Development and Use. So even though psychologist and psychiatrist, he's ontology literate and desiring.
Curious, ontology curious, yeah.
And I served as a, I don't know, invited speaker to that panel, so we got to know each other a little bit then, and I'm super excited about his work. And I'm gonna let you talk about the impact of his work.
Sure.
It is extravagantly interesting.
Okay, thank you so much. And that's a great idea. I'm gonna start writing, I'm gonna send you all a thank you note from chat. Yeah, that's my first introduction through AI. That's actually really, this is a milestone, and what an appropriate place for that to happen. So I am, yes, I'm ontology curious. I was on this ontologies committee. I've been doing like ontology adjacent work for like 25 years. I just didn't know. Maybe about 2010 is when we started thinking, yeah, this is really about ontologies, what we're doing. But for a decade before that, you'll see how I think about it as I tell the story of some of the work that we've done and the problem we were trying to solve. It's interesting to me, this is like another disclaimer, to give a talk. I usually talk to mental health professionals and policymakers and maybe government people. So to talk to a room full of computer science folks is a bit new. And I'll be curious to see how wrong I am about some of the things that I think, but also to see what's of interest to people and where you go. I'm hoping that you'll see some things in here where you think, oh, that's an obvious opportunity for us. That's something we could easily make better. We've been trying to make certain things better for a long time. And part of the reason I'm here in town this week is because we recognize that there are now very sophisticated ways to try to solve the problem we've been thinking about for many years. And so we're here to learn more about how to do that together. Just this title alone, like I want people to think about this notion of therapeutic intelligence, and I'll talk about structured collaboration. So I realized this week how important terminology is. So therapeutic intelligence, like when we think about that, it's really about how do you make anything that's known about how to produce healthy behaviors in others. How do you make that known to people so that we act in a way towards one another that brings out the best? Now, I work in the behavioral health industry. I mostly train mental health providers and do research on what we should be training to mental health providers. But all of the things that we learn, and you'll see as you go through how it should make sense that these things are not magic, like how to make people happier, how to make people have fewer problems, things like that. They generalize to all of us, and they're potentially extractable knowledge from the evidence base that we could all use to kind of live in a community where life is a little better. And structured collaboration, really, I think of that as like this asynchronous researchers, some of whom may long have been retired, can collaborate with us through the artifacts of the research that they've left for us to extract some nuggets of ideas that we can then use when we collaborate with families to help them navigate their problems, right? So how do we create an architecture that allows this exchange of ideas and people to work together to produce the outcomes that they want? So well, you know what's funny? I've had issues when I'm on WebEx with advancing the slides. Okay, there they go. Disclosures, this is some of my funding. We told folks yesterday a story. We came up with a short thing about practice-wise, because I always put this disclaimer, and I have to do this because I work at UCLA. Many, many years ago, we solved a big problem in a state mental health system that I can tell you all about. And so many other states wanted to have a solution, and we ended up building a business around that after failing to give it away from state to state and trying various other ways of doing things. The excitement around some of these ideas has been so great that that business has sort of taken on a life of its own. I'm not super involved in it, but I have an ownership interest in it. And some of the things that you'll see from our research are things that go out to the community through that mechanism. New York State is one example. Practice-wise is the biggest supplier of training for mental health professionals for children in New York, for example. We do a lot of training all over the US. So, all right, so what is it that we're doing though? I like to start with this quote, like everybody, we all are aware, I guess post-pandemic too, the world is a challenging place. We have lots of science. That's where I live. Not exactly where I live, but that's Los Angeles. And how do we get these ideas into communities, right? And I like this quote that we need big leaps. We need to think big. A lot of science. I've always been an impatient person. I've had a hard time with how slow science can advance things. And I like the idea of like, let's just break the whole model and do things in a different way. And the second, this sentence at the bottom, I think I highlight this, yeah, is what really gets me is that every day we know more as a species than we've ever known about things we care about and many things we don't care about. And tomorrow we'll know even more, right? So that, we just never get off that train of, so far because we're good at storing what we know. We're not good at retrieving what we know, which probably you're all better experts in than I am. So it's a sad state of affairs that you're about to see that, we can say today we know more about mental health challenges and what to do about them than we ever have known in 10,000 years. And we're not doing a very good job mobilizing that knowledge to get impact. What does it mean to mobilize that knowledge, right? We are talking about not just curing diseases or making disorders go away, but think of a vision of transformation, of helping people become their best selves, achieve their potential, suffer less, thrive more. And this is a values claim I'm going to put out there. I believe the quickest way to do that is through empirical procedures that say, the best idea is one that comes from some evidence. There are other epistemologies out there, so I'm just putting it on the table. I operate from the idea that I would rather try something that's worked for somebody or anybody than to kind of have a different model for selecting what to do next. So what's the current state of affairs? See already from this picture, it's not great. 20% of the world has a mental health challenge at some point, right? There's enough of us in this room that there's at least a few of us who have or will have or have had challenges. Most people, we talked about this on the call this morning, most people with mental health challenges in the world receive no services of any kind. The vast majority of care that is delivered for the people who finally make it through the various barriers of cost and inconvenience to get care, depending on where you are in the world. The vast majority of that care is not based on evidence. It's not something that's ever worked for anybody. Generally doesn't work when we study the care that's delivered in communities. Yes.
I would like to handle questions during talk or after.
Probably after, because I have so much content. That's a great question. And so it's ironic that I answered it, I guess, but that'll be the last question I answer. Good one, though. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned this on the call today too. Half the people who do actually receive even evidence-based high quality care, they drop out. The workforce is unbelievably insufficient to solve the world's mental health challenges. I work in countries that have no mental health providers, some places, and you're dealing with like bus drivers and school teachers to deliver mental health care because there is no industry of behavioral health in some places. But there are mental health needs, and the global cost is high, regardless of the dollar amount. It's high, and suffering is bad, and we'd like to make it go away. So now, because you're all terminology people, I'm going to start with like, how long have humans been thinking of how to classify problems of the mind? And I couldn't possibly have given someone COVID that quickly. That's like the rap, and it jumped over everyone else. So humans have been thinking about ways to classify the mind for a long time. So this is from the 1300s. This is like the ascent and descent of the mind tapestry. This one over on the right, this is the four humors from the Greek philosophers tied to the Elizabethan diet. What I like about this one on the right is you're already mapping problems to solutions, right? I'm going to talk a lot in the next hour about how we go from problems to solutions. So I happen to be melancholic. It doesn't mean I'm sad all the time, but it means I'm kind of a quiet person, usually. So I should be eating more peacocks and butter, for instance. So if you guys know any good restaurants that have peacocks, tell me later. Everybody's like, not so sure. And there is a model. Now, we don't necessarily think this model is evidence-based, but people were making models for hundreds of years to say, what do we do about issues with the mind and how do we modify our behavior, our diet, our lifestyle, whatever, to deal with some of the challenges we have. I'll bring this up to the modern day, right? So yes, for centuries, we've been mapping problems of the mind to solutions. So let's think about this all in terms of problems and solutions. And you have to believe, if you can't make it past this premise, the rest of the talk won't matter, that there's a key relationship between problems and solutions. I mean, it's almost tautological, but by definition, I guess, we're talking about things that are going to make these go away. And the whole enterprise of what we do, this is probably generalizes way beyond mental health, but this is the way we think about it in mental health. We have to identify what the problems are, and then we have to choose from a list of solutions. So I'm going to start getting into the weeds a little bit more. Let me tell you how we've been dealing with problems in mental health. Like 120 years ago or 100 years ago, we had early theories about problems were just based on, should we describe symptoms? Should we describe other aspects of problems like their course or their causes? Right? You can label things based on where they came from as opposed to what their symptoms are and things like that. A lot of those debates were going on 100 years ago or so. Even before I was born, the DSM, people may have heard of the DSM. That's probably the Bible of diagnoses in mental health. It's probably in the US, it's the most widely used classification system. It's kind of an ontology of disorders of the mind. You can see how many editions there are. So it's like, I guess all ontologies do, it evolves. I don't know why it evolves sometimes. My kids have asked me why there's so many versions and I don't have a good answer. People disagree and they fight over things a little bit and they make little tweaks and modifications. So we're up to the DSM-5. There's 11 versions of the ICD is another system. These are all categorical approaches, by the way. So like you're either in a category, you have a disease or a disorder, or you don't. There's a huge literature that's gone on for almost 100 years too about measurement, personality measurement and so forth, psychopathology measurement. That's dimensional, which is more like if you think of IQ, right? It's dimensional. You're not like, I'm smart or I'm not smart. It's not categories. And lots of measurement goes on in mental health using these dimensional approaches. I've just put a couple of things here, like in children, there are these big, widely used systems. We're working on one instrument among many that get used. And those generally, the use cases around those are to see whether elevations are high enough to warrant care, choose a focus for care, and to see whether whatever you're doing is working, right? So this is kind of brings us up to today, in a way. This is kind of the state of the art. We measure things with established instruments. They have evidence to support their ability to detect things. Where are we on the solution side? So 50 years ago, well now 75 years ago, treatment, I just think about that when I think about this with an ontology lens, it's so funny because at that time, treatment was just a thing. All treatments were kind of considered the same thing. Treatment, talking to someone was treatment, and then about their problems, and then everything else was not treatment, I guess. And there were the basic questions were like, does talking to people help? Can you help people? And the big scholars were writing at that time about, does anything work that we can do to help the challenges that we're starting to identify in the early DSM, 1952 and so forth. Around the late 1960s, when I came into the world, people started asking questions about, are there specific kinds of treatments and they work for specific kinds of problems? So this mapping of problems to solutions is really only about as old as, well, it goes back to the Elizabethans and way beyond. But in the modern way that we do it, a lot of this came out of writings in the late 60s of saying, we need to classify, name treatments, label what they are. We have these defined problems over here. we need to figure out which ones work for whom. In the 1990s, this is a little bit of Albany trivia. The dominant policy in mental health now, when you say something is evidence-based and you say that it works, it's based on a set of standards that were written in 1992, and they were written at the University of Albany, SUNY Albany, across the river here, by this task force led by David Barlow, who was a professor there at the time. And then there was a list of, the first list of effective treatments using those standards was published in 1993 by Diane Chambliss, who's in Washington, D.C. To this day, from 1992 onward, 30 years later, this is the paradigm that we have inherited. To say something is a treatment that works comes from the work that Barlow and Chambliss did 30 years ago. And we have lists and lists and lists of what works. And the standards are, you have to have a certain kind of research trial and a certain number of them and so forth. They're very complicated standards. I don't know if they're very good, but they're still in place. So what does that mean in the meantime? There's over 2,800 talk therapy interventions that have been tested in over 1,500 randomized trials. And 900, more than 900 of those meet the Chambliss and Barlow criteria to say they're evidence-based and effective. That's a lot of treatment. So you might be sitting here thinking, oh, we're terminology people, we're thinking about what is a treatment? You know, what does that mean? Well, they said, it was actually Chambliss who said, a treatment has to be a book. Literally in the definition, it said it has to be in a manual form. So it could be a soft cover or a hard cover, but it had to be codified in a book. And if it wasn't, it doesn't matter if it cured everything in the world, it doesn't count as an evidence-based thing because it wasn't codified in a manual. Okay. Most mental health systems in the US use fewer than 3 of those 900. Globally, most places you go use 0. There's a dissemination failure, right? And it's this huge gap between what we know and what we do that we need to solve. So where are we now, right? You're probably familiar with this with all the other projects you do in healthcare. You know, we have about 80 systematic reviews published per day, 75 RCTs, and 11 systematic reviews published every day in healthcare. Depending on which reviews you look at, there's an enormous amount of research being published. This is a provider trying to get a job done. This is why you can't do therapy. This is my graduate student from 18 years ago, John. And he actually made these slides to demonstrate this concept, which is you come to graduate school, you're excited about learning an evidence-based treatment. It's in a book because Chambliss said it had to be. And as a second-year student, you realize, wow, there's more than I thought. This isn't so great. And as a third year, this is John. And this is John not finishing his dissertation because there's too many treatments. He came in on the weekend once and made these slides, and it was prophetic in a way because at the time there were about 100 manuals. We owned about half of them, you can see. Now there's 900. And so he was even seeing the problem that was coming, which is there's no way to learn and consume all of these things. And what did we do? You know, what can I tell you about this? I can go off on sidetrack stories, and I want to be careful. Okay, so just let me summarize what I've said so far. The current model in the world, if you need mental health care, is to establish a diagnosis. It usually uses a non-standard instrument or unreliable way of doing that. And then to provide what we call usual care, which is the provider does whatever they feel like, because that's the way care is delivered. There's not really a lot of oversight on care that's delivered. In the best case, they might select one of these manualized evidence-based treatments that meets a standard of evidence. It's unlikely. We've been studying whether people do that. They generally don't. Decades of research have shown that most mental health concerns are not categorical anyway, so the whole diagnostic model doesn't really fit very well. Assessment practices and service settings are not evidence-based anyway, so we're not effectively identifying problems. We have lots of studies showing people getting treatments for problems they don't have. We study community mental health systems, all kinds of treatments are being given. like trauma-focused treatments for kids who have no trauma, you wouldn't think that would go on, but it goes on. And why? Because someone's trained in that, and they go, this is what I'm competent to deliver. And you look in the child's chart and there's no, and their history, or we do an assessment of the child and there's no evidence of traumatic history, right? This is the state of the field. There's lots of research showing providers really dislike books and manuals. They're not an effective knowledge structure for people to retrieve the ideas they need to be successful at their jobs. Doesn't mean providers are illiterate or don't like books. They don't like books for this purpose. Right? They're not useful. There's a whole variety of reasons why. I guess one of the big ones is they're not dynamic. What I know from research we've done, 70% of cases have some crisis that throws the plan into a left turn and it never comes back. Comorbidity is extraordinarily high. 50% of people drop out, which you heard about before. These kinds of things are usually not handled in books because the books are done, you know, in a study that's tightly controlled and tightly managed, and exceptions are kind of screened out of studies. But in the real world, things go wrong, and especially in mental health, things go wrong a lot, and the books don't always help you. So even when things are mandated to be evidence-based, they're usually not. So this is a huge, huge policy failure and failure as a society to act on the accumulated knowledge we have, which is incredibly, it's great. It's fantastic, by the way. You wouldn't believe how many useful things there are known about how to bring out positive behaviors in other people. It's unbelievable. So what we did, you know, we were, my colleague who was not well, he and I won't tell you the whole story, but there was a while where we were in the state of Hawaii. I was an assistant professor. I was 31 years old. Hawaii is a small enough place that at 31, someone can invite you to be in charge of the mental health system because there aren't a lot of experts there. And at 31, you're also dumb enough to say yes to that invitation because you don't know how hard it's going to be. And I knew enough to know I should call on my friend Eric to try to convince him to move to Hawaii, quit his professor job, and help me fix this mental health system. And this notion of structured collaboration said, look, if we don't have the ability to, it's not just that you have to buy the books. Once you buy the books, you have to buy a $500,000 training workshop series and so forth from the person who wrote the book, who has to come out, stay in Hawaii. Everybody wants to do that. They want to stay for 6 months and supervise everybody, whatever. We could afford one book. We bought it. It was about $1 million, the investment in the one program. It served 15% of the kids in Hawaii. The other 85%, it was Wild West. People were doing all kinds of things. I remember people were duct taping kids to trees. People were taking them on. One of the big programs that I had to shut down was they put a whole bunch of people on a wooden sailing ship and they'd go out to sea for 30 days. All kids with juvenile delinquency. They would come back. It would come back like a pirate ship. They were like more aggressive and worse behaved than ever, you know, and they've been at sea for 30 days. Super expensive programs, right? That's what I inherited when I said yes to that. So in some ways it was a good thing because it's easy to improve on that. You know, you can shut down the sailing ship and so forth. But it really meant, how do we take a workforce there and make them perform better? How do we get ideas out of the literature to help empower people, to help kids have better lives? And we started by just reading studies and then summarizing what we knew and say, we're not going to get all these books. We're just going to get the knowledge that's in the books and communicate that knowledge directly to the workforce somehow. So there's this like knowledge extraction task. And there's a levels of analysis thing in treatment, which maybe should appeal to ontologists. Because of Chambliss and Barlow, interventions were all by name, like here's intervention A, intervention B, intervention C, just think of these as books. And the field has committed to an ontology of practice that this is what you buy, this is what you implement, this is what you tell everybody you're doing, you name the book. I'm doing the Coping Cat program from, you know, which is from Philadelphia, or I'm whatever, there's 900 of them. However, the field does acknowledge that some books kind of belong to a family of things that are similar. So parent training, may not have heard of the term parent training, but there's a whole collection of books that people consider them to be parent training. Parent training is a therapy approach where you teach parents how to parent in a way that reduces disruptive behavior and non-compliance in young kids. It's spectacular, by the way. If you ever have kids, there's like 10 things you want to know that are from these, there's many of these interventions. We couldn't afford the books. We knew parent training was kind of important, but how do you you could read a chapter about it. So, and remember, the model is you get a diagnosis, let's say it's disruptive behavior, and you get, if it's disruptive behavior, you get treatment A or whatever. And we said, how are we going to pull knowledge out of these books? And at the time, we didn't really know much about ontologies or anything. We did know what we're trying to do. I remember having a conversation with somebody, actually. I said to one of my colleagues, I think most of these books are the same thing, and they just have a different author and a different cover. And the contents are pretty similar, Everybody's heard of Time Out. Some of you are at the age you may have been in Time Out, recently, I don't know. But I was put in Time Out a few times. And Time Out is in many of these books, by the way. It's very effective. A lot of evidence for Time Out. Well, so we were like, how do we extract these nuggets? And we were reading, Eric and I were reading about just some of the stuff that was going on in image detection on Venus. Why were we doing that? I don't know. It's just a hobby. Eric reads a lot of weird things, and he was reading about, and what people were doing 20 some years ago to recognize volcanoes on Venus. And there's this notion, if you blur the picture, it's easier to classify volcanoes than it is to have a sharp image. And so we thought that concept, what if we kind of blurred the details of these manuals? This one uses a cat as its main character. This one uses a puppy as its main character. Those are things we want to spoil away. They're not essential ingredients, but we want to focus on what is the essential structure. Now I realize that's a lot of assumptions and what's essential. But we had some idea that there'd be things that show up repeatedly. So we began reading and coding things as a state committee. And we read close to 200 protocols, and we got about 60 things that came up total. And only about 15 of them come up often. 15. And I was like, we can teach 15 things to what's the workforce in Hawaii? At the time, it was only like 500 mental health providers in Hawaii. It's so small. That won't be long. And my graduate students and I would fly over to the other islands, and we would tell people, what are the 15 things you should know, and so forth. Yeah, so only about 15 are common in things that are effective. So I'll give you a concrete example. So those 3 interventions that are parent training interventions, like these are the kinds of procedures. You might see that they all have praise. Oh, there's a delay when I look over this way. They all use praise. Praise, you might go, oh, what's praise? Is that a psychological procedure? There's a ton of research on praise. There's ineffective praise and effective praise. And you can greatly increase the probability of a behavior repeating itself if you praise in a particular way. Ooh, you might ask me afterwards, what is that way? It really bugs me. Right? So these are great nuggets. I mean, they're all, there's all of these things. There's a whole body of research behind each one of these. What you can see, we code 72 books, and we see that that all have worked in a research trial, and praise is the most common procedure used. Now, do we know, has it been dismantled? Was that the active ingredient? We don't. But are we providing a picture for people? What are the components? I was talking about cookies earlier today. I don't know what makes a cookie great, but I do know I can figure out what's in it. And if there's butter, sugar, this and this, we tell people, these are the things that are in a good cookie. This isn't stuff that works for disruptive behavior. We do have some ideas about recipes too. I'm not going to talk that much about assembly today, but they do get assembled in a particular way, just like cookies get put together in a certain way. If you put them together in the right way, they're probably going to be effective. We don't know exactly which ingredient is essential or not. So there's something about putting them all together. So this is what we're trying to do. Get all of this unordered hundreds of things into basic facts that people can act on, right? We just published a paper recently looking at like the proliferation of manuals. That's the dark line for disruptive behavior. So this is when we wrote the paper in 2015, there were 131 manuals. So you can see like people like me, we get incentivized by grant money to publish manuals. And so like there's just this increase in manuals over time. And this dotted line is those procedures inside the manuals. And the innovation going on procedurally in mental health, it stopped right around when I was 9 or 10 years old, which is perfect timing to help me navigate all the challenges I might have had in my teenage years. But there's really not much more going on. A new procedure hasn't really come along in mental health in a long, long time, despite what you read in the paper. We're just reorganizing the same stuff and we're testing it in new contexts and populations. This is where we were when I was working. This is where we are when we published this paper. This is where we are today.
Oh my God.
So, and I don't want to tell you where we're going to be in 2 or 3 years, right? Like it's just, you know this problem. I mean, what is it, 90% of the stored information is usually in the last 2 or 3 years, kind of thing. So, what we've been trying to do is imagine how do we solve this problem that is definitely getting worse? And the gap between what is known and what we do obviously gets larger because what we know is just racing along. I think of it as, you know, I don't know if this metaphor is going to make sense or sound silly, but I tend to think of it as like, as revolutionary as the difference between maps and GPS. Like the current paradigm, the 30-year paradigm in mental health is that every disorder, in other words, every errand you have to run has a paper map. If you're depressed, you do this book. If you got to get groceries, there's a paper map for that. You follow that map. It's not dynamic. If you make a wrong turn, if there's traffic, forget it. It's a map. Also, it's inconvenient because you have to look at it while you're driving. It's not a good knowledge resource, but it's probably better than pulling over at a gas station. This is what we do. If you need to go to work, it's a different map. If you need to go to the gas station, that's a different map, right? Every disorder, every problem has a different book. Unfortunately, some of them have 15 or 20 books, and you have to decide which one you like. What we're trying to do is say, can we build a coordinated system that just says, where are you now? Where are you trying to go? And we're going to just feed you ideas as you go along, and we're going to tell you if you're getting closer to your goal. We're going to give you the best guess, or we're going to recommend a path to you. You can, you know, they're both efficacious. If we did research trials on these, they both get you to the supermarket. But one's personalized, one's dynamic. So if you make a wrong turn, it's self-correcting. One accommodates diversity. I don't like tolls, right? So, or I do want to be in the HOV lane. You know, so user preference can be accommodated easily, and it's just easy to use, right? It's there, it talks to you. We don't have an evidence-based in mental health that does anything near this at this point. So, good timing. Okay, I'm just checking to make sure. I tend to get really far behind, so but I don't want to get confident either. So what we've tried to do is in this fairly crude way. I guess if you think of the early GPS things that are chunky, even that is like, it's not a good metaphor because that stuff is so sophisticated. It depends on so many things. But we've tried to build things that work in this way. And we've just tried to build them without your kinds of expertise. And even doing it in that lousy way, you're going to see, is so much better than what people have been doing. You know, how do we build these things in mental health? You know, it's this combination of, well, it's an overlap really of various things. And so like for GPS, I think of it as like you have to code streets, then you have to have the software and hardware. You have to have some measurement feedback on your current position. You might have local traffic data, so what's going on around you. We have strategic intelligence, right? So you have satellites and you have some high level coordination of all this information. And in mental health, we have really good analogs for all these things. I already introduced to you the 4 humors and the Elizabethan diet, right? So there are ontologies of problems in practice. They're lousy in my field. And they don't allow us to have things work like this, but they exist and they can be improved on. And this is where we'd like to do more work together. There are ways to make those things modular. I remember going to a publisher 18 years ago and saying, we should publish those nuggets like praise. And the book would be 10 pages long. And then we should publish one on timeout. That should be 10 pages long. And they said, no, we don't do that. We publish books. We said, oh, this will be so much more actionable. And it's modular because you can just use the one you need. And then we can have a system that would recommend which one to use when. And they said, no, we really sell books kind of thing. So the whole enterprise, the institutions built around and the incentive structures make us produce artifacts that aren't useful. But I'm a big fan of designing these things that are modular at the level of decision-making and activity. There's a ton of research on case-based evidence, like measuring as you go, and that's important. So knowing what your current position is, that's what we use the ARCADs for. What's the local evidence? So we do a lot of, even though research trials are important, you know, an example, when I was in Hawaii, there was a group home on one of the islands, and there was about a 50% chance if you put an adolescent girl into that group home that she would run away within a week. I don't need a research trial to know that I need to go over there and figure out if like the girls' room has like an open window or whatever it is, but we had elopements constantly and crisis constantly. That local evidence and seeing a pattern in your local evidence was important for us to make a correction. I didn't have to read any studies to know we had to do something. We have expert supervisors who kind of like monitor the position of everything. That's a standard part of mental health care. You're going to see an example of that in just a minute. And then we have process models. You can also think of these as the recipes when I talked about cookies. How do these things all go together? When all of this is working together, like I said, it's more than prototypes. We have working examples of these things. They're just not, they might not seem elegant to folks who do things at your level of precision. But crude working models of these things work extremely well. And I'll give just a few results. So this is Eric's 2006 paper. Eric's the one who's unfortunately sick today. This is where in a 3-year period, and you know, look how far on this is July 2001. So these are really old. Sometimes I show this to people in mental health and like, wow, this is new. This is groundbreaking. And I say, you have to look at the x-axis. This is not new. It's 20 years ago. This is the rate of improvement of every child in the state mental health system in Hawaii. And lower is better. So the effect size more than doubled. The budget, we were able to spend half the money on mental health and get the same outcomes after a 3-year period. Just doing this kind of teaching people how to praise, teaching people how to do timeout and things like that. And how they go together and so forth. We've done tests of these things against the gold standard, the books. We've tested our systems against the books. The red line is our modular way of doing things that are dynamic. You think of GPS. The blue is the 3 best treatments we could find, working with the MacArthur Foundation to get the best 3 treatments we could find out of those 900 in the country. And we tested those against a GPS-like system. And then this green bar is usual care, like whatever was going on in the community. Turns out evidence-based care, the best stuff we have is about the same. These are 4 different kinds of outcomes. You don't have to really worry, but I guess this means nothing to computer science people. Internal means like anxiety and depression. External means aggression and anger. Total means all of that stuff together. And top problems means this is what I worry about, which might be none of the above. It might be I don't have enough friends or whatever the family's top problems were. On all these outcomes, these dynamic systems that pull nuggets from the evidence base, extract stuff from these books, did better. We've done the same thing in LA County. Trying to think how many people we've served in LA County now. 600,000 families in LA County. So that's a pretty big impact. That's like filling Dodger Stadium 12 times with families who've gone through this model. And these effect sizes, these are pre-post county data. The effect sizes are great. They're as good as you'd see in trials. 12 years after we implemented that, we had, this was one of the, in California, this was like This is the thing I was telling the story the other day. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger had to sign off on this before it could get going, which was there's a lot of weird things about California, but the day, it's like a year after I moved there, and then, the Terminator is signing some order to say that we have to go train people in LA County. I was like, this is not, well, maybe this is everything I thought LA would be, right? Yeah, so we trained 3,000 people. They've now served over 500,000 families. And we did people like randomized trials. We did a randomized trial in California, and we crushed the other, we're the red bars again here. And the green bars was all the other training. They invested in all this other evidence-based manuals. In the control group, they put 30 manuals in the control group against one GPS-like system in the red group. And the thing is, if you give people 30 maps, they don't navigate as well as if you give them GPS. I mean, that's the bottom line. You need to make the idea recommender, whatever it is, that has to be pretty easy to use, pretty dynamic, and it has to fit all the preferences and decision architecture that's in that particular business model. Okay, so last thing I wanted to show you. This is like the latest stuff that I've been working on now. Is people tend to think about treatment as just what happens in a therapy, like in my field, and maybe in how anyone thinks about treatment. They tend to think about treatment as what happens in a therapy room, like an hour a week of therapy is the treatment. But in fact, if my treatment works in a trial, I would confess to you the secret knowledge that no one tells you is, I'd say at least half of what's effective about that treatment is what goes on outside of the therapy room. And I'm not saying the kid goes home and practices things and mom practices things and dad practices things or whatever the family needs to do. I'm saying what we do, the organization that provides care, we do a ton of stuff other than that hour of delivering service. And all of that has to go just right. And if any part of it breaks down, I'm going to show you an example. Things go terribly. It's like lately I think of it as like a bowling alley. And the question is like, how soon are you going to go into that gutter? And once you're in the gutter, you're not coming out of the, ball rarely comes out of the gutter and hits the strike, right? And it's a long bowling alley in mental health. So we've tried to say, we need to come up with not just terminology to describe the therapy procedures, but all of the clinical activities that go on around those. And that's what I've been studying now for the last 6 or 7 years. It's like, what happens in between therapy sessions and stuff? And I'll give you an example. This might sound like, this is too abstract, maybe, I don't know. But again, I have problems and solutions here, and there are activities and resources. When I think about classes of things we need to actually be able to talk about together, those are kind of 4 big groupings. We've talked about problems and solutions. Activities are just things that people do, and then resources are objects, entities. They can be people, they can be objects, they can be devices, they can be books, they can be manuals. A dashboard is like a display, right? So here's some examples of how, you can basically use one way to code. We're trying to come up with a way to code any possible aspect of clinical care, including what happens in treatment. So here's one where a therapist considers several diagnoses. So you consider diagnoses. Here are some diagnoses over here. You select one, maybe you select a mood disorder. We call that assessment in my profession. That's called assessment. It's a thing that people do. You bill for that procedure. You come up with a diagnosis. Here's one where a therapist and a supervisor monitor symptoms on a dashboard. So here's the RCAT showing up again. So here's a resource, a couple of resources, an anger inventory. We're looking at it on the dashboard. Therapist and supervisor monitoring together. What are they monitoring? They're monitoring symptoms of anxiety, depression, and anger. We call that outcome monitoring. It's like live, real time. You measure what you're doing as you go along. Therapist applies a protocol using a treatment manual. That shouldn't seem too foreign to you now. I've been describing that's been the whatever the gold standard, I guess, for 30 years. We just call that treatment, right? So that's actually looking at what protocol are you using, what book. Right? I know I'm throwing a lot of terms around, and That's why I'm here. There's a lot of terms that we need to understand and clarify. I like to think about things at the practice level. Again, that's those little nuggets that we pull out of the books. Therapist and supervisor work together to select the practice. That's called planning. So what are you going to do when this family comes in next week? I'm going to do psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is when you explain to people how therapy works so that they trust you and they believe that the therapy will work. If you skip that step, most people won't believe that the therapy is going to work, and then they won't do whatever you ask them to do. Usually therapy asks you to do things you don't like. And they definitely ask you to do things that you haven't been doing. And this tends to make it more likely if you explain to the story why. We call that, well, that's psychoeducation, but this whole enterprise is planning. You could say, oh, let's plan to do exposure. That's practicing stuff that you're afraid of. You know, how do we pick these things, right? Again, there's a whole model for that. Will we pick it from what are the problems or symptoms we're going after? I don't know why I circle those. Okay, so I want to give you an example. We recently did a trial where we said, let's look at clinical activity, not just in the therapy session, but between therapy sessions in supervision, how it's managed, and try to apply this framework of labeling various behaviors that occur so we can understand them and potentially manipulate them and influence them in a way that's positive. So I'm picking a few activities, considering, selecting, and applying. I'm picking problems and practices, solutions abstracted at the practice level. That level is like timeout, praise, the things I've been talking about, exposure, you know, some of them are listed here, behavioral activation, that's going out and doing fun things to make your mood better. I make these things sound really simple. They're a little harder than that. It's like, you don't just tell depressed people, go have fun. It doesn't work. But there is a way to do it, to get people to do mood boosting activities that increases one's sense that changing your environment does change your mood, which is hard for people to understand until they do it. Okay, so if we organize these things into a stream, we assess problems by considering the various problems, selecting one we're going to work on. And then we plan practices by considering what are the practices that might be appropriate to use, and then selecting one to try. So this is like that recommender stuff where it's like, well, we want to funnel people into like considering only the best ones, but not just one. You know, people like to have choices, and there's local context that comes into play. Then they select one and then they apply it. And as I have said repeatedly on this is treatment. What people do generally isn't very helpful. And so this is why we're now studying, like, what are the upstream determinants of what people do in therapy? Because we'd like it to be helpful, because we know in research it works. So this is supervision. We call that supervision over here. Supervision happens between therapy sessions where someone actually checks on what you're doing and they're supposed to do these things. It's not really clear. There's not a lot of training in supervision. You know, we're just starting to think we should train people how to supervise better. So this is, okay, so last couple of things before I show you some data, and then I'll stop for questions. Assessment of the problem is facilitated by established measures like the RCADs, which we've been talking about this week, scales that map the constructs that are known, and then those constructs map the solutions, right? So we know what works now for depression. We know what works for anxiety. We know what works for bedwetting. You know, we know lots of things, what works for eating disorders. Like, that's all known. And mapping means, well, first we have to know, well, what is the problem? And we have to have the right instruments for that. And then over here, filtering down to the relevant practices and getting them to be retrievable and actionable. How do I teach a family how to do timeout? It's really hard. Sounds simple. It's so easy to do timeout wrong, and timeout gone wrong is a disaster. It turns into punishment and anger and shouting and sometimes even shoving and fighting. And so there's a lot to getting people to do things right, but these things aren't even retrievable very easily and even known to be effective to most people. So what we did, we just finished a randomized trial in South Carolina. We went into this area that's east of Columbia. I don't know if anybody from South Carolina here, if you're familiar with the area, between Myrtle Beach and Columbia, there's this region that's basically sweet potato farms and like super disadvantaged communities, very, very high rates of poverty. Nobody's moves out of the region, so everybody's kind of like in this insular community, and record-setting poor quality education system, like some of the worst educational outcomes, 40% high school graduation rates, nobody's literate in things as they should be, and people are failing standardized tests on math and whatever. So a really disadvantaged region there. And then in the other site was Los Angeles. We're proud to say our graduation rate in public school is 47%. And we work in neighborhoods that are pretty much characterized by violence, poverty, drug use, whatever. It's challenging places. We compared PG, practice guidelines. So because there are so many books, and they pay people like me to get together and go to a conference for like 5 days, read a lot of things, and then write down a set of recommendations, and then put that on the internet and hope people read it. And so that was our control group. We actually wrote recommendations that matched what we built into this coordinated knowledge system, this sort of GPS thing that tells you what to do when. We gave people the practice guidelines. We trained them in them. We like walk through it in a workshop in the control group, just to say everybody knows what to do for these things. You don't have to worry about what the context was. And then there's a couple of different kinds of outcomes I want us to pay attention to. Whether they even did this activity, did they consider any problem is going to be like a white bar. And then did they consider a problem that actually matched the problem that the youth had is the green bar. And so this is the bowling alley, by the way. So we just let go of the bowling ball. Everybody considered, this is actually at 100% white bar for both. Everybody considered something. They talked in supervision about what might be wrong with this child and blah, 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 you know. And only 44% happened to talk about something that was the kid's actual problem, that was in the chart and in the clinical record as their focus of the problem. 98% of this group did, because we gave them a little thing they could hold in their hands that organized all this information in one place. Picking a problem that matched the problem that mattered to the kid, 80% versus 5%. And this is like, after you train people in practice guidelines for a set of problems, it was only about 12% of people that even chose which problem are we going to focus on when this family comes to see you. So they went from like a general discussion to just drifting into the gutter of the bowling alley kind of thing. The conversation kind of just drifted on to other things. They never said, this is what we're going to pick. Moving on to, okay, so what practices, what should we do about this problem? 93% pick the practice that fit the evidence base. Like, it's not just it was a practice that's evidence-based, but it was evidence-based for the specific problem the kid had. And then there's a little bit more to that bar that's not a very small amount considered other practices that are not an empirical fit. 20% down here, that's basically like rolling five-sided dice or something. It's not good. It's not better than chance. Picking and then deciding what are you going to do tomorrow when the family comes in. 85 versus 20%. And when we get to the treatment, here are the results here. So it's about 80% of the time. We did nothing here, by the way, in this trial. We just taught people how to have this conversation. And this could be like 6 days later, 10 days later. Sometimes it's 3 weeks later. There's an 80% chance they're going to do something that is evidence-based for the problem the child has versus what is sort of typical, about 40. And you might go, how did that come back out of the gutter? It's a weird thing the way this works. There are certain things that work for almost anything. Like if I told you like relaxation, somebody might just go, oh, we just did relaxation for the hour. It turns out relaxation is appropriate for a lot of different problems. It works for anger, it works for anxiety, it works for depression. And so some habits, it's like they got lucky because their favorite procedure or habit just happened to be something that fit kind of thing. But you can see it's about double the odds. So moving away from the clinical part, what's hopefully of interest to this group, or where you see opportunities, like we have no language to describe all of this kind of clinical decision-making that goes on. And we know it is clearly important to the quality of care to understand, label, and modify the behaviors that occur in between treatment events. So I'm going to pause there because I said I would answer questions. And here I am ready to answer questions. Yes.
If you go back one slide, please.
Okay.
So what I would be missing here is the quality of treatment in the end. So how much was there an improvement of the problem, right? Because this is just the match with the pre-categorized data. What I think is the major grading of psychotherapy, whether the condition of the client has been improved.
Absolutely.
So was there any assessment of that?
There is assessment of that. I don't have those data to analyze. I mean, I don't have those data analyzed. And I have a bit of a qualified answer here, which is, yes, we measured youth outcomes, but the point of this trial, we were funded to see if we could modify this variable. And so we manipulated 2 of these supervision meetings out of like 40 in the episode of care, right? So there might be like a year or 9 months of therapy. We zoomed in on 2 treatment sessions and 2 supervision meetings beforehand to see if we could move the needle here and get a proximal, what they call provider outcomes. They call them implementation outcomes. Can you change practice delivery? There's other research showing those procedures work and get the outcomes. If we wanted to, so I think we will get some outcomes, but I think it's that we're actually measuring 5 different problems in this study. There's a lot to it. I don't know that we're going to get fantastic outcomes because the dose of this was just like, we just zoomed in for a tiny slice of the treatment episode to see if we could change what happened in 2 sessions. And then we left. Why did we do that? And you might think, oh, why didn't we do? Because we digitally record every supervision meeting, every treatment session. We transcribe those. We have 2 people code them. Just to do that much is such an expensive study that people want to see this before they say, oh, go ahead and do that on the data set I want to reanalyze in the next. So, but it's a good question. It's a question the sponsor wants us to look at. So we do have those. But to me, I would say like that's not the question we were asking in this trial. We're trying to change provider behavior in this trial. And that's what we set it up to do. Other questions?
Sure. So did you guys end up publishing those like 10-page practice modules?
Yeah, we did. And people use them. But they're very similar to what I showed the lab here in terms of like, they're basically PDFs and static HTML page representations of these nuggets. And yeah, 100,000 people use them in 85 countries and whatever, but they're still organized in a way that's like not elegant, but it's not 900 books, which is good. Yeah.
So you said the CKS is essentially right now like a reorganized version of the existing handbooks, right?
Yeah.
It's I'm curious to like what extent it has been built. So like, have you guys like gone through all the relevant literature, or was this built off of just like a couple?
No. The literature, so this study, I haven't said what this study was actually about. This study was about reducing dropout. There are 50 randomized trials, which is pretty small, that talk about dropout in youth mental health services. We read all of them. We first did a systematic review of those treatments. We published a paper on it, and then we took the results of that paper and we basically did the matrix of how we coded that literature. Was there's 5 different reasons people drop out, and it tends to be there's about 22 little things that people do, 11 of which are common, that seem to be associated with preventing people from dropping out, but not everything works for everything. So we had to make a map for people of like, if this is first you have to figure out what the reason is. Do they not like you? Do they not they had a friend who had therapy and that friend didn't get better, and so they don't believe therapy works, you know? There's many reasons why, and each of those reasons has a different solution. We give those providers a map of that solution in their supervision meeting, where they make a social contract. You know, we know from psychology, if you tell somebody you're going to do something, your odds of doing it are much higher than if you decide on your own. So that's why we do this in a dyad. And yeah, so it was based on a review of 50 trials. The problem is, we call it it sounds fancy. It's a paper. This is a paper, a proof of concept, right? It's a published meta-analysis. It's a one-page representation of that. That's a tool people take into supervision. But that will have to be rebuilt every couple of years without some kind of, modern way of organizing that knowledge. Yeah.
So I'm actually curious as to why do you see such a huge disparate use of CKS versus practice guidelines? You said that so you were on the guideline committee, right? So basically the practice guidelines. So basically the practice guidelines. They are also supposed to be based on sort of systematic reviews and clinical trials, right? Why do you see that there is this kind of lack of use of the guidelines versus the CKS?
Yeah, I think part of it is practice guidelines are not as clear about telling you what to do when, and they don't walk you through. We built something that, this bowling alley thing. We built something that walks people through this procedure that says sort of step one, before you start thinking about what you want to do in the next therapy session, what do you think the problems might be? And have a conversation with each other about the problem. And look at this instrument and this thing. It's like a pre-flight checklist. Look at the data before you decide what the problem is that you want to focus on. That habit is not established naturally without a set of prompts and supports. And then this is one of the hardest parts, is then to say, what are potentially relevant solutions? People don't go back to practice guidelines and let me go see if I can figure that out. And so some of it is I don't know, if you ask me why it worked, we're doing a study now just manually to try to figure out why. But some of it is just having an object to take in the room and having that object be small enough and convenient enough that it actually does make it into the decision-making environment. That's why I'm a fan of watches and something that you can have on your phone, because anytime something has a little bit of friction, people leave it out of the decision-making environment and then they make a decision in a different way. So, they were given the same information. It was basically just organized differently. Yeah.
Could you please repeat at which point of therapy? You said there were 2 sessions that the intervention happened in, right? Therapy. At which point in therapy did it happen, and which school of therapy were the therapists in?
Oh, the therapists were all different kinds of things. They were just kind of community therapists. In South Carolina, I don't know what they did. They just talked to people and they were warm and encouraging. You might call that humanistic. They did stuff that you wouldn't consider super effective, but it is nice and compassionate. And in Los Angeles, since we've trained most of those folks and other things, they mostly do cognitive behavior therapy and things. And the sessions we were dealing with were around session 4 and 5 in a course of therapy, because if you've made it to session 4, which a lot of people don't get that far, that's a point at which it's a good time to assess the risk of disengagement that occurs in the future, because you know enough about the therapy now and you know enough about your therapist to be able to report on. Part of the system is the kids and the parents tell us what they think of therapy at week 4. And they might say, this therapist is terrible. He interrupts us all the time. He never stops talking. He never asks me anything. He doesn't understand my culture. Blah, blah. That's all reported at week 4. And then we come in and we introduce this for 2 sessions and say, we want you to try to stop doing what you were doing and try to, this family is at risk of dropping out. We want you to do something to keep them from dropping out. And, just comparing two approaches in that situation, these are the results we got. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
Oh, yeah, let me,
I had a very generic question. Can we get links to those small 10-page manuals that you said is published? I'm just curious to know what is there, like the content of those and access to your slides.
sure, both, yeah. I'll send you links and, I can send you all kinds of interesting material, yeah, sure.
Thank you, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Behind you, and then I'm gonna go back to you, yeah.
So, so you mentioned one of the things coming out of this collaboration would be to like establish the vocabulary, right? But like, I'm just wondering, so this coordinated knowledge system, are you thinking like this will end up being like a knowledge graph type thing? Or like, is it more than just organizing the vocabulary? Like, do you want to do some kind of reasoning on top of that? Or is there like system level integration that needs to be done? So like really what's the reasoning behind like incorporating like semantics or AI in this kind of approach?
And let me give you some context. So he's the one doing the abductive hybrid reasoning.
Oh, yeah.
Through question, she's the study cohort ontology person. You mentioned many of you.
Well, I don't have a great answer. I mean, that's partly why I'm here is because I don't know. I mean, I need you to say like, where do you see the opportunities in a way? There's a couple of parts to answer your question. One is the current collaboration is like, it's down to doing like one toenail of the elephant of, we're talking about right now, something we have funding for is to collaborate around an assessment approach to assess anxiety and depression in children. And so like, that's our kind of toes in the water. That's what got me to Troy today. And, but the real reason that I reached out and, why did I get on the ontologies committee before is because this notion I presented to you early, that the way we represent what is known is not actionable and retrievable. Like I just have a general sense, that's why I say I'm ontology curious. Like I have a general sense that you all have expertise that can help solve some of that problem. That making what's known that's right now mostly in human readable only form and is growing faster than humans can read it is a problem that we need to deploy some technology to solve. And the tactics of that, I wouldn't dare tell you what I think those should be. I know enough to come here and listen to people who know how to do that. I do know what we do now is totally terrible and it's extremely expensive and it mostly makes people like me get tenure and prizes and publish books. But the community is not benefiting from the investment and the taxpayers who pay for most of that research have children who go to school and drop out because all the things we've learned from that research are not activated in those communities. Like, so, if you know things about how to solve that, that's what we want to do. Yeah, you were going to say something?
I had a question.
Yeah.
So is there data that can be like that's accumulated over time about the kind of say treatment that was taken for a particular case and the outcome of that particular case and like if it was positive versus negative and stuff like that? Is that data like available from different practitioners?
Generally, it's not easily available unless we enroll practitioners and families into some kind of a trial. So we have a lot of data from our research trials that are coded this way and so forth. And in the future, I don't know. I mean, I helped design the Hawaii mental health system. And so, yeah, we could get we could know what practices were done every week for every kid in that state because we set it up that way many, many years ago. But most places you wouldn't even know what happens in therapy. We're doing a study now, we're trying to code chart notes to try to figure out how do we know what happened in therapy. It turns out we can extract some information with human coders and chart notes and then We want to look at whether we can train an NLP model to do chart notes. We generate billions of chart notes every day in the world. I mean, it's, no one reads them and we rarely know what's going on. So this issue too, like, can we get the data to see what's happening? That's a huge challenge that has to be solved also, right? We need to know what's happening. We need to know what the research says should be happening. We need a way to have a structured comparison that would then drive a decision. Most of that architecture is not really robust.
I think I saw a hand raised. Is,
Yeah, I think it's
Dan?
done.
Yeah.
No, I had a
Dan, are
similar
you
question.
on audio?
Yeah, I had a similar question, which was just that, is there data on the trajectory?
I see your mouth moving, but we don't hear you. Maybe you're on mute.
I think our audio.
Can you hear me now? I think maybe you might be on mute.
Yeah, we see you, but don't hear you. And I wonder if there's a volume thing or?
Do I need to, let's see, oh yeah,
No, but
Hear me
it's
now?
on the right.
it might be a speaker problem.
LG signage, not,
It's LG sign.
yeah, not the rally.
Getting to you, Dan, hang in there.
But in the meantime, maybe you want to type it in the chat.
He looks kind of furry.
And then I just realized I have a dissertation
Oh,
to share and.
Oh, Cisco service not responding. Oh, that's interesting. Matt can hear him over the WebEx. Huh.
Try again.
Oh, unfortunately, the audio, yeah, the top one.
Oh, that was the right one.
Hey, Dan.
Can you hear me now or?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay, so I had a similar question to the last one. It's sort of using the GPS analogy. Is there data in the system, either from patient records or from the manuals? If a patient presents with this problem and we've tried this and it didn't work, what is likely to maybe be a next thing to try versus a treatment? If that didn't work, then this other treatment's likely not to work. So you can sort of help people and sort of say, like, this was mildly effective, this wasn't effective for this reason. Here's something that we would recommend as the next thing you try with this patient.
No, the elegant short answer to that is no. Like, so the conditional probabilities of if treatment A fails, people do some studies on that, on like medication trials. And then they do medication failures. There are some studies that are set up like that, but generally the answer is no. And at the practice level that I've been talking about, so like, again, the bigger problem here is that treatment is generally codified at the level of a book. And so we generally evaluate an outcome still in this field by you do 16 weeks of this book. And then when it's done, you say, did it work? And if it didn't, you say it didn't work for you, sorry. And it's over. And this idea of like doing a procedure each week is still not the way the field thinks about decision-making. At least that's not the current policy. So even the idea of like, I tried something this week, it didn't work, what should I try next week? The field doesn't even have the vocabulary yet for describing practices at a unit of analysis that would occur in a single encounter. That's what Eric and I have been trying to kind of popularize for 20 years. I mean, people talk about it now, but the way the world still operates is either people do whatever they want and there's no known way of describing what's happening in practice. People just talk and we don't know what it is, or they do these books, manuals, and they kind of evaluate it when the whole book is done. And there's, what people want to do is make that week by week decision making, but we haven't represented the evidence base in a way that lends itself to dynamic weekly decisions. And so, yeah, the whole idea of conditional probabilities, like we could get there if the field organized itself around an encounter by encounter decision model. But right now it's the counter paradigm still,
So I think you had like a summary because we're.
Yes, my summary was, my summary slide is just to say, it's just repeating, we can do better. We need a better knowledge infrastructure than we have. And so I'm excited about talking to, what I would say are the crude prototypes that we've made for 20 years have transformed many systems, but they're doing things with paper handouts, Excel spreadsheets, and, not very elegant ways of doing these conceptually elegant solutions. And that's really what brings me here, is the thought that this can be modernized and put on platforms that are industrial and scalable. And I believe if we do that, we will go from Bruce and Eric, who've had a tremendous disruptive success with a market share in the world of about 1% or 0.5%. You know, we'd like to see these kinds of ways of doing care that work so well propagate, but we realize the barriers are mostly technological now and not conceptual. And I realize those play together. Anyway, that's my summary. So hopefully it's encouraged you to think what you're doing can be super valuable in the stuff that I'm trying to do. And you all should know that we need people like you talking to people like me and my teams. So thank you for letting me come visit. I have to chair a dissertation in about half an hour. So, which I'm going to do from my hotel. So as I pack up, if anybody has other questions and they want to come, well, don't come too close to me. But you're welcome to shout a question to me as I'm packing up as well. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I hope to be back talking with all of you as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just an addendum, we are kicking off this smallish